So I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Dave Edwards, a remarkable man. Dave Edwards is a senior lecturer in history at UCC, and he is a graduate of Trinity College, Dublin. And he has written prolifically on the late medieval and early modern Irish history. His principal area of research inquiry is power and society in Ireland from the Gaelic resurgence of the 14th century to the wars of religion in the 17th. He has written some fantastic books and publications and articles, including Age of Atrocity and the Life of Richard Boyle. But more importantly than all those credentials, Dave is a genuine, humble scholar, and he was one of a very small handful of people who were willing to be interviewed for the Castle of the Island documentary, and somehow he agreed to be interviewed. So thank you so much, Dave. So a very warm welcome to Dr. Dave Edwards.
Thank you, Robert. And believe me, it was a pleasure to be asked to actually talk about the history of these earls, the Earls of Desmond, the Earls of Ormond, the O'Brien Earls of Thomond, and so on. These are the great lords in Ireland up until the English reconquest and the age of plantations, which begins in the middle of the 16th century and carries on for much of the 17th century, which completely transformed the country. So the history of these earls, of these lineages, that's what it is. If you look at a map of Ireland, if you look at a map, that's the map of the counties. That's actually the wrong map, typical. But if you look at a map of Ireland, one done by my colleague Kenneth Nichols, who died last year, unfortunately, a great historian of the Kerry families and so on. Ireland in the 16th century, the 15th century, the 16th century, the 1400s, the 1500s, was a land of clans, a land of lineages, a land of chieftains and earls and lords and so on, and all of the families who were affiliated to them, who supported them. So the O'Dailys, the O'Dawley, who are filia, or poets, that they're the senior poets, and Shanachie, historians, record keepers and so on, of the Earls of Desmond, and of other lineages around Munster and so on. All of these families, this is the hierarchy of Ireland before Ireland was made English in the 16th and 17th century. So I want to thank Robert for making a film about the Fitzgerald Earls of Desmond. It's the first one, and it's a very, very good start. Thank you. Okay, so what my topic today is obviously on the Desmond Rebellion, 1579 to 1583, which marks the end of the Earls of Desmond. That's when effectively the earldom is over. There's a couple of earls after that, but they don't really have an earldom to be earls of after 1583. So the last great Earl of Desmond, Gerald Fitzgerald, who dies, is killed, beheaded, basically in the mountains here in Kerry in 1583. He's the last great Earl of Desmond because he's the last Earl of Desmond who had the earldom. He had all the lands in Kerry and Limerick and Tipperary and basically Waterford and also parts of Cork. It was a vast but scattered earldom. It wasn't a unitary territory. It was pieces, a large piece of Kerry, but in the other counties I mentioned, pieces. And that made it difficult to administer. We might come back to that later. But what I'm particularly concerned with today is this idea of rebellion. In Ireland, we have a tradition of honouring, celebrating rebels, rebel Irish, that they're kind of heroes. They stand up against the kind of foreign invader, against English rule, etc., right down, of course, into the 20th century. And while that is a central part of the narrative of Ireland, of the history of Ireland, we've got to be careful with how we approach it. Because rebellion is a very dangerous thing. It's a very dangerous thing to do. And as we know in Ireland, nearly all the rebellions end in bloody failure. So to enter into rebellion is to enter into a desperate calculation. This is your best opportunity because all the other opportunities to sort out your problems have evaporated. And that's where I want to start with. How does Desmond in 1579 get to that desperate place? Okay? So, he made a real effort to avoid rebellion. And he's not the only Irish leader of the 16th century who tries to avoid rebellion, because they all know it's the 16th century. The monarchs of England, who also claim to be monarchs of Ireland, the Tudors, give very short shrift to rebels. And to be found guilty of treason, as again Robert's film yesterday shows, is not just to be killed, it's to be hanged, drawn, quartered, your entrails pulled out of you. It's a public demonstration of cruelty to underline the sheer frightening power of the state. So rebellion is a very dangerous step to take, and the consequences are enormous. For you, but also for your followers, and your lands and your families and all the rest of it. It's the age of plantations. The plantations follow upon rebellions that failed. Okay. Other Irish figures of the 16th century who involved themselves in rebellion had started out as supporters of the crown, because in terms of calculation, in terms of their responsibility to their family, to their inheritance, to all of their followers, the hundreds and thousands of people who are dependent upon an Earl of Desmond, an Earl of Ormond, an Earl of Tyrone, Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. The best solution for them is to align with the English crown. Keep the English crown out by pretending to be its friend. And yet you have people like Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and Gerald Fitzgerald, Earl of Desmond, and even Shane O'Neill, Shane the Proud, ending up in rebellion and paying the consequences for that. So, that's where we start. What does the English crown want the Irish earls, Irish lords, to do in the 16th century? Again, we're talking about the Tudors. So we're talking about the most famous, infamous of them, Henry VIII. What is Henry VIII famous for? Well, he had 6 wives, 2 of whom he executed. Okay? Dangerous man. Henry had broken with Rome in 1533, and by 1534, the Pope, who tried to persuade him to change his mind, had excommunicated Henry, which meant that the Kingdom of England and all of its other dominions, which include Ireland, the English claimed jurisdiction over Ireland. They exercise power in parts of Ireland. Much of Ireland, they don't exercise any power at all, but they claim the right to do so exclusively. All of those lands, if the king is excommunicated, the people inhabiting those lands who are loyal to the Catholic Church cannot, in conscience, obey the rules of that king. This is a very dangerous situation for everybody. So, Henry VIII requires Irish lords to recognise him as their overlord. And in 1541, he has himself crowned King of Ireland. He creates the Kingdom of Ireland in 1541. Summons a parliament in Dublin, so all the yes men will be gathered there to say, yes, your highness, no, your highness, you are the King of Ireland. And they passed the Act for the Kingdom of Ireland in 1541. Irish lords are expected to sign up to this. We know that the process by which this was done are by treaties known as treaties of surrender and regrant. The Earl of Desmond in the 1540s, the great Earl's father, had entered into one of those treaties of surrender and regrant, had recognised Henry VIII as King of Ireland as well as being King of England. Desmond himself, when he succeeds his father in 1558, will also do this. He won't have to enter into a treaty. The treaty is already done, but he will recognise the king's rights to sovereignty over Ireland. Along with that, Irish lords are expected to give up their control of traditional law Much of it is Gaelic law, much of it is Brehon law, and simply have an English law instead. English statute law, English common law, which means English judges, not Brehons, not Gaelic families like the O'Daly and so on. They have to accept English military control, which means the emergence of a shadow network of control in parts of the country which we call garrisons. And that starts to emerge from Henry VIII's reign. They have to accept English language and English dress, because Irish language and Irish dress are deemed to be uncivil. So to be civilized, you have to be English. You have to demonstrate your Englishness. You had to demonstrate this in how you spoke and on how you dressed. And there was legislation passed in the Irish Parliament pushing this through. And then you had to also accept, from Henry VIII's time onwards, that the real push factor in all of this was the fact that Henry was excommunicated. He needed to take control of all his dominions. He was doing similar things in England, but he didn't have to travel as far to impose his power in England as he had to travel in Ireland. He had to do a lot in Ireland in order to impose his power. But what he really wants is he wants all the Irish lords, and through the lords, all the people who follow them, to accept him as head of the church, not the Pope. Accept his version of religion. Desmond's father had gone along with this, 1542, and died in 1558. Now, we mustn't think in this you have to look at this kind of wryly. Desmond's father had accepted Henry VIII as head of the church. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Desmond's father had accepted a 9-year-old boy, Edward VI, Henry VIII's son, as head of the English church. The 9-year-old boy died 7 years later, aged 16, of consumption in England, and was succeeded by his Catholic half-sister, Mary. And Desmond's father, accepted Mary as head of the Church of England, and she restored England to Rome. You just accept whatever religion the crown has at the time in order to be left alone. To be left alone. Desmond follows in the path of his father. He cooperates. He never defied English sovereignty. Even when he rebelled in 1579, he writes directly to Queen Elizabeth I several times as his sovereign. He never denies her rights, the English crown's rights, to Ireland. He accepted the emergence of the presidency. I'll see now if this works. There we go. Yeah. That's Sir William Drury without his yellow trousers, who was the Lord President of Munster between 1576 and 1579. He accepted the English Lord Presidency, which brings English law, English courts, English officers, English men into positions of power and control in large parts of Munster. He accepted garrisons in Cork, in Limerick, in Kilmallock. English forces, again, to control strategic points along the coastline, along the rivers, and all the rest of it. He wore English dress. He appeared English-wise. He went to the English court. Sometimes he went there voluntarily, sometimes he didn't go there voluntarily, sometimes he was brought there in chains. But he accepted. Crucially, Desmond accepted the Protestant religion. We don't tend to remember this because in the 17th century, Dominic O'Daly, writing a memoir of what the downfall of the Geraldines, and Dominic O'Daly was a senior Catholic churchman, redrafted the recent history of the Fitzgeralds as being defiant of English Protestant power. Desmond was not defiant of English Protestant power. When he was married for the second time, 1570, and his wife, Eleanor Butler, gave birth to a boy, that meant the earldom had its next earl. That meant the earldom had a future. And that boy, when Desmond leaves England in 1573, is left behind to be brought up by Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, one of the leading Protestant ministers of Elizabeth I, as a Protestant English gentleman. This is the calculations that families have to undertake in the 16th century in order to survive and in order to be left alone. So how come, having done all of these things, does Desmond become a rebel? It's not what he wanted to do. He knew the price of being a rebel. It had been demonstrated numerous times in Ireland before the 1570s. The public executions, the seizures of lands, the devastating warfare that could ensue. There are big forces in play that Desmond has no control over. England is again isolated in Europe. Henry VIII had separated from Rome. His son, Edward VI, the boy king, had maintained that separation and had started to develop England as a Protestant kingdom, the late 1540s into the 1550s. But that had been stopped by Edward's death and the accession of Mary Tudor, who returns England to Catholicism. Mary Tudor is known in England as Bloody Mary. Why? Because she burned 365 Protestants at the stake in 1554 and 1555 to stamp out Protestant heresy. England was a Catholic country again. Elizabeth I inherited a Catholic kingdom of England. This is something we need to know as Irish people. We always assume the English are Protestants. In 1558, when Elizabeth I became queen, England was not a Protestant kingdom. It was a Catholic kingdom with a Protestant queen. So the history of Elizabeth's regime is about the gradual growth of Protestant power in England, regrowth of England of like Protestant power in England. And she surrounds herself largely with Protestant ministers and so on. She doesn't like firebrand Protestants, they stir up trouble, but she's determined that England will become a Protestant country. However, she maintains diplomatic relations with the papacy that have been restored by her half-sister, Bloody Mary. And during the 1560s, as Desmond is becoming Earl, this is the reality. Elizabeth I is a Protestant queen who's willing to go along with Catholicism to some extent. She has an ambassador in Rome. There are Catholic agents of Spain and Portugal and France and so on nearby in Whitehall Palace. Catholicism is possible under her Protestant regime in the 1560s. But religious militancy is not just a Protestant thing. Elizabeth didn't like militant Protestants. As I said, they caused trouble. There's also Catholic militancy. And we have the Pope. Pope Pius V in 1570 and his successor, Gregory XIII, excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570. She's queen of a country that is still mostly Catholic. She's a queen who's been on the throne, this is 12 years in 1570. She hasn't married. She never will, which means she'll have no children, which means the Tudor dynasty is going to die with her, which means other people are thinking, who's going to be queen or king next? There's plotting and scheming going on in England. More to the point, there is a queen. There's another alternative to Elizabeth I, who is currently a guest of the state in England. We know her as Mary, Queen of Scots, who'd fled Scotland in 1565. Mary, Queen of Scots, has a right to succeed Elizabeth I as her cousin on the English throne, and Mary, Queen of Scots, is Catholic. So Mary, Queen of Scots is like a sort of lightning rod, attracting the attention of conspirators who want to rid themselves of the heretic Elizabeth, who's now excommunicated by the Pope. And if you were responsible in killing Elizabeth I after 1570 for religious reasons, the kind of rationale at the time would be you will go to heaven for doing a good deed. So Elizabeth I after 1570 is in serious danger. And there's a whole load of Catholic plots against her. My namesake, and basically no relative, a guy called Francis Edwards, published a book on basically assassination attempts on Elizabeth I. There's more than 50 of them in her reign. They're all Catholic plots against her. So this is a real problem for Elizabeth. Whatever about Elizabeth, what about all those ministers who she had surrounded herself with, who were all Protestant? If she goes and Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic, becomes queen, they're gone. And if they're gone, all their lands and all their interests and all the rest of it are gone too. So they have a vested interest in protecting Elizabeth I, keeping her on the throne as long as possible, and stamping out her enemies. So militancy, religious militancy, becomes front and foremost one of the main characteristics of English government policy from the 1570s. The laws against the Catholic subjects in England are strengthened and strengthened and strengthened all through the 1570s. We think we had the penal laws in Ireland. The English Catholics had them first. Okay? And it's to protect the regime. Not just the Queen, but all the people who are in positions of power and wealth in Elizabethan England are protecting themselves. There's a lot in play here. So Desmond is going to have to deal with an increasingly militantly Protestant regime that is desperate to stifle out Catholic threats, Catholic power. And Ireland, of course, is the most Catholic part of all Elizabeth's inheritance. The Kingdom of Ireland is the most Catholic kingdom that she has. England is still a Catholic kingdom, but it's transitioning to Protestantism. Ireland is not transitioning to Protestantism. So Ireland's quite exposed. That's one problem that Desmond has to deal with, that he has no control over. And that's why he hands over his son in 1573. It's basically money in the bank, so to speak. He's putting his child there as a kind of guarantor that he will do whatever Elizabeth and whatever Elizabeth's ministers want. He will conform, he will conform, he will conform. And then you have other forces at play which undermine Desmond. And these are things that he had no control over either. To a large extent, we mentioned in the film yesterday, his own physical limitations. He was lame, which meant he walked like that. He wasn't good on a horse. A nobleman is good on a horse. Desmond had to be helped onto the horse. It wasn't his fault, but that was the reality. People at the time in the 16th century saw being lame as being inferior. That's why his father had bestowed so many favours on John, the next eldest brother, John of Desmond. Then there's John. John has ambitions of his own. If Desmond, who'd been married to a middle-aged woman, the Countess of Ormond, who was herself a Fitzgerald, Desmond's not expected to have children by his first wife. That means John will be the next Earl, or John's son, when he's married, will be the next Earl of Desmond. He has skin in the game. He wants to be Earl of Desmond next. Okay, and then there's the other guy, the half-brother, Thomas, who was a son of the previous Earl of Desmond by another union. Declared basically illegitimate, then basically re-legitimised, but he had a claim, and the English government were prepared to recognise that claim. Why? Because that would keep Desmond and John of Desmond in control, because there was an alternative to play against them. This is how politics works. This is how dynastic politics can at times injure itself. There's numerous claimants, which means divide and rule. So the English government can play divide and rule with the Fitzgeralds. And Desmond, to a large extent, has no control over that, except to get married again as soon as his first wife died. He marries Eleanor Butler, Countess of Desmond, and has the son by her. And that means he now has control of the future of the earldom. He has control of the future of the dynasty. He has a son and heir who will inherit after him, which means John of Desmond no longer has that prospect. John of Desmond now has a problem with the boy, wants the boy to be delivered to him, into his care. That's not going to happen. And instead, the boy is delivered into the care of the English government. That's a fractured political system. That's a fractured political regime. And then you have the third component Desmond really has no control over, which is, excuse me, it's a kind of national force. It's the growing power of English officials. It's not just that there are more English officials in Ireland in the 16th century, and there are. They're breeding like rabbits. They're popping up everywhere. Yeah, it's not just that, but it's the fact that they're in Ireland, not in England. They're far from the control of the central government in London. They're in Ireland. They're often off in the provinces here in Munster and in Connacht and so on. And they develop a great deal of independence, autonomy. They act independently. They act at times in defiance of Crown orders. Because they can. There's really not going to be many penalties for it. So a lot of them are involved in building up the English power. A lot of it is military power. A lot of them are involved in local military policing and so on. But more to the point, they are looking after their own interests, which they're starting to develop here in Ireland. And this starts at the top. The head of the English government in Ireland is the Lord Deputy or Viceroy. And in the 1570s, at the start of the 1570s, is a man called Sir William Fitzwilliam. So Fitzwilliam is sworn in England as Viceroy, meets the Queen, etc., comes to Ireland with instructions from the Queen about what he is to do. And as soon as he gets to Ireland, he ignores those instructions and does exactly what he wants. And this affected Desmond directly. Because Fitzwilliam is made Lord Deputy of Ireland Viceroy in 1571 after the beginning of the Munster presidency. The English president, Sir John Perrott, who was mentioned yesterday, did not want Desmond back from England. He wanted Desmond kept in England or else somewhere else, but not in Munster, because Perrott is building the presidency and he's using the sword to build the power of the presidency here in Munster. 800 executions in 1573, all public executions, all hangings and quarterings and all the rest of it, to underline the English have taken control of Munster. He doesn't want Desmond coming back and putting a stop to that. He wants to get on with it and impose himself. So what happens? Desmond is sent back to Ireland. He's left his boy in England. He's sent back to Ireland by Elizabeth I to take control of his territories. But he has to visit Fitzwilliam in Dublin first as a courtesy call to the head of the government. And what happens to him? He's arrested and put in Dublin Castle as a prisoner. Perrott had written to Fitzwilliam. He didn't want Desmond back. So in the end, Desmond leaves Dublin Castle without licence. It's called an escape. By walking out the front door when he was going for a constitutional walk after lunch. He just didn't come back. And he went back to Munster. And that's when he goes to Lochgur and he renounces the English clothing and puts on Irish dress. And he regains control of his territories. And in order to regain control of his territories, he's entering into what's become a conflict zone. Many of his people have been suffering from Perrott and the presidency. They expect him to defend them. If he defends them, they will follow him. If he doesn't defend them, they will not follow him. And the Earldom of Desmond is effectively over. So those are the realities at the time, okay? Okay, so the mid-1570s have this religious sectarian energy in it. A Protestant regime desperate to defend itself against Catholic plotting. You also have here in Ireland, in Munster, an English presidency determined to impose itself at sword point on the population at large. You have a new governor coming in, replacing Fitzwilliam in 1575, Sir Henry Sidney, who's very much part of this as well. And he sends a guy called Henry Davils to Waterford, and he gives him a commission of martial law, and it's well worth reading that commission, because that says you can kill any supporter of John of Desmond, John Fitzgerald of Desmond. Leave the other people alone, because you can kill them. So there's a series of executions, of targeted executions of Fitzgerald supporters in County Waterford in 1575, 1576, 1577, that Sir Henry Sidney authorised. Drury carries on the same policies. We've seen him already. Just go back. He carried on the same policies here in Munster. And he established basically devils in Kerry, along with a guy called Arthur Carter, who's the Provost Marshal, who's the senior martial law. He's the execution officer for the Munster presidency. That's why they're killed in 1579. They've been killing Desmond supporters, John of Desmond supporters in particular. It's no wonder that John of Desmond, as soon as he got the chance to bump them off in 1579, took it. These are largely factors that are out of the Earl of Desmond's control. He's been sucked into rebellion. But rather than go into rebellion, what does he do? He gets involved in political efforts to negotiate with Elizabeth, to change the direction of English policy. He works with the Earl of Ormond, of all people, and with the Earl of Kildare. They want to have an aristocratic government in Ireland in which their rights will be respected more than they have been. And he contacts Elizabeth I, and he sends her Christmas presents in 1578. She writes a letter back saying, "Thank you very much." And she sends him presents in return, and his wife, Countess Eleanor, gets apparently a really nice dress from Elizabeth I and so on. This is soft power in operation, but this is also negotiation in operation. But he gets something more important, and it's in the Walsingham letter book. Yeah. And it's Elizabeth promises Desmond that she will have an inquiry held into how he and his followers had been mistreated by her officers. Now, if that goes ahead, it means the direction of policy changes. It means these independent English officers in Ireland who are used to doing more or less what they want are going to be held to book, held to rights. They now go, they double down. They go at Desmond and his family with added energy in 1579. This is the path that he's been walked down. What ultimately does for him, back to religion again, is the return to Ireland of James Fitzgerald of Carrigaline. And James Fitzgerald, mentioned in the film yesterday, is a Catholic zealot. He's been to Rome. He's got support from the King of Spain. He's got this private force together of Spanish and Italian invaders who will land ultimately at Smerwick in County Kerry in 1580. But when he first arrives, he only has a handful of Spanish agents, but he has one powerful Catholic Church representative with him. Dr. Nicholas Sanders, formerly an Oxford University lecturer who'd been thrown out of Oxford University for refusing to take the oath of supremacy, recognising Elizabeth I as head of the Church of England, had ended up in England, had ended up basically overseas and then in Rome. And he is identified in Whitehall effectively as public enemy number one. Because he writes a whole series, and has them published on the continent, of denunciations of Henry VIII, of Elizabeth I, as heretics and all the rest of it. He's seen as being one of the masterminds of Catholic assassination plots. He arrives with Fitzmaurice in Kerry in 1579 as papal legate. He has documents from the Pope, and he sets about trying to stir up a war of religion. What's going on at this moment in France? The wars of religion. France is destroyed by the wars of religion in the 1560s and 1570s. Sanders is trying to deliver that, and that's the way the English see it when he arrives with Fitzmaurice. Now, Desmond's response to this is interesting. He avoids contact with Sanders, Sanders obviously wants to reach him, but Desmond avoids him. because he knows that if the English officials see that he's talked to Sanders, he will be denounced himself. So he steps back. He tries to avoid. He dodges Sanders. He sends some of his men out to block Fitzmaurice. He also sends some of his men out to attack Fitzmaurice. He joins the English against Fitzmaurice. But John of Desmond has different views. John of Desmond joins Fitzmaurice, joins Sanders. And that is enough for most of the English officers to say, Desmond's playing us for fools. We can't trust him. Go at him and all of his family. And this is the path into rebellion. There's a letter written by the governor of Connacht, Sir Nicholas Malby. Unfortunately, we don't have a portrait of him. I'm sure he was beautiful. Sir Nicholas Malby is the president of Connacht, and he decides after Drury's death in 1579 that he'll become acting governor of Munster, which was bad news for John of Desmond. Previously, John of Desmond's wife is Catherine Burke. Malby had her arrested and in Connacht and had held her in chains. She was chained to a wall to try and do a big shakedown of her estates, and basically she could buy her own freedom. But she was a noble woman. She was descended from the Burkes, the Clanrickards, Earls, and all the rest of it. This was serious. It was a seriously provocative thing to do, and certainly provocative to John of Desmond, who married Catherine Burke. Anyway, Malby arrives in Munster, and as he comes into Munster, he sends a letter back to England to Sir Francis Walsingham. We get to him now. Oh, sorry, you're wrong way. Sorry about that. There. That's Sir Francis Walsingham, who's the head of the security services to protect Elizabeth I from the assassination plots. Malby is his man. Malby writes to Walsingham and says, now, I'm going into Munster. I'm going to do some bad things. Just telling you. I might get into some trouble over this, but I'm going to do them anyway. And he did. He went to Askeaton, he went to Adair, he destroyed them, he bombarded them, he smashed up the Fitzgeralds of Desmond's tombs, including the tomb of Desmond's first wife. All of this is a deliberate affront, a provocation to Desmond. Will you defy me now, or will I just carry on humiliating you? And this is when Desmond breaks. This is the point of no return. This is when Desmond becomes a rebel. But even after he had taken his forces that were left, because most of his forces had been scarpering, even when he takes those of his forces who were left and tries to confront Malby's men in County Limerick, he writes a letter to Elizabeth I explaining why this was happening, why he was taking the action, that he was being attacked unlawfully, that Malby was breaking the law, Malby was breaking the peace. He was defending himself. But by then, Pelham, the new governor, mentioned again in the film yesterday, had turned up and taken control of the Irish government. And Pelham is taking advice from all these English basically officials who want to deal with Desmond, who want to get rid of Desmond. And they basically don't want a change in Crown policy. They're protecting themselves. Pelham's a new blow. He's only just arrived in Ireland. He's told all the bad things about Desmond, and he declares Desmond a rebel. And that's it. After that, it's the path to treason, it's the path to execution, it's the path to forfeiture, it's the way to the Munster plantation. Thank you.